Did you know that China defeated India in 5 wars? When two massive nations with rich histories and huge populations clash, the impact is felt for generations. While most of the world watches their political and economic competition, there is a lesser-known story that runs deeper. China's military victories over India in 5 major conflicts. What led to these wars? How did China consistently outsmart India on the battlefield? India and China fought their first war in 1962. It was an armed conflict between China and India that took place from October to November 1962. It was a military escalation of the Sino-Indian border dispute. Fighting occurred along India's border with China. The main cause of the war was a dispute over the sovereignty of the widely separated Aksai Chin and Arunachal Pradesh border regions. Aksai Chin, claimed by India to belong to Ladakh and by China to be part of Xinjiang, contains an important road link that connects the Chinese regions of Tibet and Xinjiang. China's construction of this road was one of the triggers of the conflict. In 1950, the Chinese People's Liberation Army invaded Tibet, which the Chinese government regarded as still part of China. Later, the Chinese extended their influence by building a road in 1956 to 67 and placing border posts in Aksai Chin. India protested against these moves and decided to look for a diplomatic solution to ensure a stable Sino-Indian border. Nehru's policy on Tibet was to create a strong Sino-Indian partnership, which would be catalyzed through agreement and compromise on Tibet. This apparent progress in relations suffered a major setback when in 1959, Nehru accommodated the Tibetan religious leader at the time, the 14th Dalai Lama, who fled after a failed Tibetan uprising against Chinese rule. Mao Zedong was enraged and asked the Xinhua news agency to produce reports on Indian expansionists operating in Tibet. Border incidents continued through this period. In August 1959, a clash led to the death of 9 Indian border policemen. Various border conflicts and military incidents between India and China flared up throughout the summer and autumn of 1962. In May, the Indian Air Force was told not to plan for close air support, although it was assessed as being a feasible way to counter the unfavorable ratio of Chinese to Indian troops. In June, a skirmish caused the deaths of dozens of Chinese troops. The Indian Intelligence Bureau received information about a Chinese buildup along the border, which could be a precursor to war. On 10th of October, the Chinese troops opened fire on the patrol of 50 Indian troops, thinking they were intruding into Chinese territory. The Indians were surrounded by Chinese positions. They managed to hold off the first Chinese assault, inflicting heavy casualties. They helplessly watched the Chinese ready themselves for a second assault. In the second Chinese assault, the Indians began their retreat, realizing the situation was hopeless. The Chinese troops held their fire as the Indians retreated. This was the first occurrence of heavy fighting in the war. This attack had grave implications for India, and Nehru tried to solve the issue. But by October 18th, it was clear that the Chinese were preparing for an attack with a massive troop buildup. 2 of the major factors leading up to China's eventual conflicts with Indian troops were India's stance on the disputed borders and perceived Indian subversion in Tibet. There was a perceived need to punish and end perceived Indian efforts to undermine Chinese control of Tibet. Another factor which might have affected China's decision for war with India was a perceived need to stop a Soviet-US-India encirclement and isolation of China. India's relations with the Soviet Union and United States were both strong at this time, but the Soviets and Americans were preoccupied by the Cuban Missile Crisis and would not interfere with the Sino-Indian War. By early 1962, the Chinese leadership began to believe that India's intentions were to launch a massive attack against Chinese troops, and that the Indian leadership wanted a war. In 1961, the Indian Army had been sent into Goa, a small region without any international borders, apart from the Indian one, after Portugal refused to surrender the Esclave colony to the Indian Union. Although this action met little to no international protest or opposition, China saw it as an example of India's expansionist nature, especially in light of heated rhetoric from Indian politicians. India's Home Minister declared, if the Chinese will not vacate the areas occupied by it, India will have to repeat what it did in Goa or Goa. India will certainly drive out the Chinese forces. India will take steps to end Chinese aggression on Indian soil, just as it ended Portuguese aggression in Goa. By October 24th, China launched massive attacks and won the war. China took control of Aksai Chin. The second conflict between the two countries happened in 1967 along the border of Sikkim, which was an Indian protectorate at the time. Before things could escalate, Chinese intelligence collected detailed reports on the weaknesses in India's supply lines and the positioning of its troops. The PLA stationed advanced artillery units along the high mountain ridges, using their superior positions to their advantage. China rapidly developed its military technology, introducing early models of advanced communication systems that allowed real-time coordination across the tough Himalayan landscape. Chinese artillery caused heavy damage to the Indian defenses. India struggled to respond to these new tactics and found it hard to regroup. Then another conflict happened in 1987 in the Samdurang-Chu Valley. The conflict began when China deployed a company of troops to a pasture area south of Samdurang-Chu that India claimed as its own. India responded by positioning its troops on the nearby Lungro La Ridge, and both sides escalated the situation by sending large numbers of soldiers to the border. The PLA had better logistics and infrastructure in the region, including well-established supply lines and transportation routes. This allowed them to quickly move and sustain their troops in the harsh terrain of the Himalayas. Then again in 2017, a significant border skirmish occurred between India and China at the Doklam Plateau. The confrontation began when China started constructing a road in the Doklam Plateau. India viewed this as a threat to its security, as the road would enhance Chinese military access to the region. India intervened to stop the construction, citing Bhutan's request for assistance. Under the 2007 Friendship Treaty, the skirmish led to a prolonged military standoff, with troops from both countries facing off in the region. According to some sources, there was direct fighting, and the Chinese army defeated the Indian army. The recent clashes between the Indian-Chinese armies was in 2020 in the Galwan Valley. In the months leading up to the 2020 conflict, both nations experienced heightened border tensions. India was engaged in a major infrastructure development drive along the LAC, including roads and military outposts. China perceived this as a strategic threat, prompting a significant buildup of Chinese forces in the area. India's construction activities, particularly in the Galwan Valley, were seen by China as a direct challenge to its territorial claims. The situation began to escalate in early June 2020. On June 6th, Indian and Chinese troops engaged in a violent skirmish in the Galwan Valley. Following a series of confrontations and face-offs, both sides accused each other of encroaching on their respective territories. The most significant escalation happened on June 15th, 2020. A major clash took place in the Galwan Valley, resulting in hand-to-hand combat involving sticks, stones, and improvised weapons. The confrontation began after Chinese troops tried to prevent Indian soldiers from patrolling a disputed area. The clash was notable for its brutality and the use of non-lethal weapons.